Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live. Hello, Nina. How are you doing? Hello, everybody. Looks like I have survived the last weeks, and I even managed to shave, which is an upgrade from the last episode. How are you doing, Nina?
I am sleep deprived just like you, as usual. Welcome to another episode of the Winter Latina Show. Episode, I believe, 36, which is kind of hard to believe for me. And today we have a special guest whose work I've been following on X/Twitter. Don't go after us, Elon Musk. We're still calling it Twitter. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. He is a British historian. He is a political commentator and an author. His PhD is in Russian history from Royal Holloway, University of London. He also specializes in the former Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, so quite a broad specialization here. He is an author of a number of books. I think he'll tell him a little bit more about them when we bring him on, but they're linked to this YouTube live. So Marcelo, let's bring him on. And we're going to talk about divided countries in the post-Soviet sphere. So we'll start with Moldova because the referendum just took place, the EU referendum. But we're going to link them to other places, possibly Georgia, possibly Ukraine. So we'll see how this is going to work. Marcelo, let's bring him on.
Dr. Papadopoulos, of course, I forgot to put people. Don't worry, I'm fixing. All right, here we are. Welcome, Dr. Papadopoulos. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very well, and thank you ever so much for having me on your show. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion.
Well, we're very much excited about you sharing your expertise. So since I sort of ended my introduction talking about your books, if you can introduce them and perhaps point our viewers to which one they should check out first, that would be great. And anything else I mispronounced or missed would also be useful here.
Yes, indeed. I am the author of two books. The first book was published in early of 2021. It is called Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. It presents a history of how the Soviet Union gave way to the Russian Federation and numerous other Soviet successor states. And essentially, it is an examination of modern-day Russian foreign policy. My second book was published in late of 2023, and it is called Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, British Assessments of the Red Army, 1934 to 1945. In Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, I argue that British government assessments of the prowess of the Soviet military in the aforementioned period was vital to British strategic planning. And secondly, I argue that prejudices amongst British observers, in particular its military and intelligence observers, not only underestimated Soviet military offensive capability up to 1937, but also it resulted in a belittling of Red Army achievements during the Great Patriotic War. And also, I argue that the feelings of Russophobia, which were embedded in Whitehall, resulted in undermining the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of May of 1942 and the Grand Alliance. So I argue that one of the reasons that the Grand Alliance fell apart after the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945 were the feelings of Russophobia within the British government. And I should have said that Whitehall in Stalin's Russia is based on archival research. So primary source evidence, Foreign Office documents, military documents, intelligence documents, economic documents, all obtained and read at the National Archives in Kew, London.
Did you do any research in Russia to supplement the British documents?
In terms of primary source material, no. In terms of secondary source material, to a degree, but again, it's primarily from a British perspective.
Okay, that's fascinating. So you would put more blame on the UK rather than the American counterparts in the big three?
Well, it would be very interesting to see how what the Soviet perceptions of, for example, the British military was, and of British government intentions. But I think I gathered more than enough primary source evidence to corroborate a major assertion that Russophobia did undermine the Anglo-Soviet Treaty and the Grand Alliance. And indeed, many British diplomats in what was the Northern Department of the Foreign Office, it was a branch within the Foreign Office which dealt with affairs relating to the Soviet Union. They wrote in minutes and in various other manners that the hatred of British military officers towards Russia and the Russian people will bring about the end of the Grand Alliance. So many British diplomats also highlighted the threat to the Grand Alliance because of what their colleagues in the military and in the intelligence circles were saying about Russia.
That's fascinating. I mean, my impression would be based on reading Stalin's statements about his interactions with his American and British counterparts. And my impression is that Stalin had an easier time working with Roosevelt as opposed to Britain. So that would be kind of in line with what you're saying. But I saw that I can download your book on Kindle, and I like to read books these days on Kindle before I get the hard copy. So I think I'm definitely going to check this out, and I think you guys should too. How did you go from talking about modern Russia in your first book to jumping into World War II in your second book?
Well, my doctoral thesis essentially covered what my second book, Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, is about. But obviously it had to be edited. There is quite a difference between a doctoral thesis and a book. And also I introduced new additional primary source material. But it's very interesting, Nina, you raised the issue of Stalin. Stalin had a pathological mistrust and dislike of British officialdom. Indeed, Anthony Eden, the then British Foreign Secretary, mentioned in his memoirs an incident when he was in Stalin's office in the Kremlin, and Stalin took Eden over to a map of the world, and he pointed at Britain, and he said to Eden how curious it is that so much of the world is influenced by this small island. So Eden took that in a negative way, and it demonstrated to Eden just how suspicious Stalin was of British officialdom.
Yeah, I mean, I would not be surprised. It also seems to be somewhat in line with, you know, the at least initial Bolshevik decolonization initiatives, which I don't think Stalin really followed through with that, but he might have been influenced by them. Well, now I'd like to jump into our main topic of discussion, which would be Moldova. Before you guys, we went live, we talked a little bit about Moldova here, and we pointed out that we suspect that a lot of ordinary people might not be able to find Moldova on the map, much like they may not have been able to find Ukraine on the map, although it's a larger country, prior to the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine in 2022, sort of coming from the initial conflict in 2014. So I think to understand Moldova as a post-Soviet country, and also to understand this really, really close almost 50-50 results in this EU referendum, which in my opinion was manipulated very brazenly, from jailing the opposition to allowing the Moldovan diaspora to vote in some countries, but not in Russia. And the result is still very, very narrow and very close. I think this speaks to a broader issue in some of these post-Soviet states, where some people are in some ways still looking toward Russia, and some of them are Russian speakers, but not necessarily. And other people are looking towards the EU, even after the entire fiasco with Ukraine, which is obviously ongoing. And I think to do so, Dr. Marcus, we might have to look a little bit at the history of that country, especially for people who may not know much about it.
Indeed. Please allow me, Nina, to set the scene. First of all, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Rather, the Soviet Union was dissolved. Collapse and dissolved are two very different things. So, the Soviet Union was dissolved by three treacherous Soviet politicians, namely Boris Yeltsin of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Leonid Kravchuk of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Stanislav Shushkevich of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Those three politicians ignored the will of the Soviet people, which had been expressed in March of 1991, because in March of 1991, there was a national referendum in the USSR in which the Soviet people were asked, do you wish to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? 76% of the Soviet people voted in the affirmative, namely to preserve the Soviet Union. Now, the Baltic states, Moldova, Armenia, and Georgia did not participate in that referendum. The Baltic states chose not to participate because they did not accept Soviet jurisdiction over their republics. Moldova did not participate because there was internal ethnic strife in the republic at the time. Armenia did not participate because it was in conflict with Azerbaijan, and Georgia did not participate because three parts of the country had broken away, namely South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Adjaria. So 9 out of the 15 Soviet republics participated. In the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, over 70% of the population voted to preserve the Soviet Union. In the Belarusian SSR, over 90% voted to preserve the Soviet Union. In Soviet Central Asia, such as Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, in excess of 90% of the population voted to preserve the Soviet Union. But in December of 1991, the aforementioned Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich ignored the will of the Soviet people and dissolved the Soviet Union. So again, when you hear someone say the Soviet Union collapsed, be it an American commentator, a British commentator, or indeed a Russian commentator, that is inaccurate. The USSR was dissolved. Now, turning to Moldova, prior to 1992, Moldova had never been an independent country. It had been, first of all, a part of the Russian Empire, then Romania, and then it became a part of the Soviet Union. Moldova is an ethnically diverse country. On the left bank of the river Dniester, It is mainly inhabited by Russians, Ukrainians, and some ethnic Moldovans. On the right bank of the river Dniester, it is mainly inhabited by ethnic Moldovans and also a people called the Galgos, who are Turkic in origin, but are adherents to the Orthodox faith. In excess of 80% of Moldova's population belong to the Moldovan Orthodox Church, which is part of the Russian Orthodox Church. The rest of the population, largely speaking, belong to the Bessarabia Orthodox Church, which is part of the Romanian Orthodox Church. These are very important actualities for people to be aware of. Russia today, and for many years now, has been the dominant outside power in Moldova, not just in Transnistria, which broke away from Moldova in 1992, but in the whole of Moldova. So Russia is the principal supplier of energy to Moldova and is the principal investor in Moldova. Coupled together with the reality that there are approximately 400,000 Moldovans living and working in the Russian Federation. So you can see how Russia is the outside dominant force in Moldova, and also the cultural attachment that many Moldovans, ethnic Moldovans included, have towards Russia is very clear, because as I said, most Moldovans adhere to the Russian Orthodox faith. And many Moldovans will always be in gratitude to how the Russian Empire liberated the region, which was at one point known as Bessarabia, liberated the region from Ottoman rule. So when you hear someone in the Western world, be it a politician or a mainstream journalist, who are simply useful idiots of the Western ruling elites, say that Russia is an alien country in Moldova, that is preposterous nonsense. It is completely unsubstantiated, and it is a lie. Today, Moldova is a battleground between Russia and the West. When I say the West, yes, we can talk about the European Union, but essentially it's Russia, it's America and NATO. So that is why at the moment the Western ruling elites are trying to weaken Russia's predominant position in Moldova. And ever since 2020, the president of Moldova has, of course, been someone by the name of Sandu. She is pro-Western in her outlook. She's an incompetent politician, of course. She's not, she's doing the bidding of the Western ruling elites, but nonetheless, she is president. She came to power, as I said, in 2020. What we have seen in the last 4 years is, in spite of her attempts to tear Moldova away from Russia, she has failed and failed abysmally, because, as I said, Russia is the principal outside force in Moldova. There is a very strong cultural attachment between Moldovans and Russians. So this referendum was one such measure that Sandu and her backers in principally Washington carried out to try and weaken Russia in Moldova. I don't know just how accurate the result was. It was just over 50% of the population who voted for Moldova to join the European Union. There is a tremendous amount of electoral fraud in certain places in the world, and Moldova is one such country. But nonetheless, even now that a tiny majority, officially speaking, voted for Moldova to one day become a member of the European Union, That will never happen. As I've been saying for some 20 years now, Ukraine will never become a member of NATO, and Moldova will never become a member of the European Union.
So it's interesting that, Marcel, did you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
I would just like to jump in for a second because there was while Dr. Papadopoulos was making his case for Moldova, there was a comment here from Alan Bailey that he said, "I know a handful of Moldovans are all sympathetic to Russia." The fix was in the vote concerning voting, of course. And just to point out that just before we jump in on the live stream, we were chatting about exactly this, that I had, of course, I'm not making a scientific theory here because I have one example, but my neighbor was Moldovan, and the impression that I had was that they were all right with Russia. He had no problem with that. He was Russian speaker. He was Ukrainian speaker. He was actually married to a Ukrainian woman. And as I was mentioning, the level of study, I mean, the type of basic study was mostly, for my impression of the people that I know from Russia and from other parts of the former Soviet Union, the level of study, of basic study, was very leveled. It doesn't mean if you're a PhD in high energy physics or you work in the construction, the level of basic instruction was very equivalent, and that was extremely interesting for me. And to point out about the referendum, this point that you raised, Nina, was amazing to me because I haven't heard anyone talk about this. That, yeah, it was the diaspora that lives in the European Union was able to vote for it, but the diaspora that lives everywhere else was not able to, especially Russia, of course, which is the main country for a diaspora of Moldovans. They were not able to vote for this or anywhere close to it. And the point was that yesterday I was listening to Alex Cristoforo from the Duran, and he was exactly explaining, he didn't say that, which caught my attention, but he was explaining exactly that the referendum took part and the no was winning, very, very winning. And when the day changed and the diaspora was able to vote on, Europe, then the vote flipped. It was almost 56% against joining European Union, and then the day changed to the next day, and the diaspora voted, and it flipped to 51% pro. Plus, this is Dr. Papadopoulos mentioned that there can be some fraud inside Moldova, but we have also to remember that the way to fiscalize whatever is happening outside Moldova is much harder. I mean, people voting outside Moldova, it's hard to keep track of all the votes. You can just print votes. I know as a Portuguese, I receive here the paper to vote, and I don't know, perhaps someone is voting in my name.
Yeah, I think it's the question of whether diasporas, especially those that have been living abroad for a long time, should be voting in the first place, I think is a difficult one because they don't really have that direct investment in the country. Yes, they may have some family there, but I as a Russian diaspora member living abroad, I can, but I do not vote in Russian elections because, well, it's kind of tricky, but also I don't have that direct investment, and I will not experience those direct consequences from my vote. we could obviously discuss the question of direct democracy in general, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. But that's one thing. Obviously, the fact that one diaspora is allowed to vote and the other diaspora is not allowed to vote is sketchy, to say the least, which you would not see that mentioned in the mainstream Western media coverage, maybe buried somewhere at the end of an article. But the one quote from Maya Sandu going around in all this coverage in the Western media is, quote, "Criminal groups have attacked our country with tens of millions of euros, lies and propaganda, using the most disgraceful means to keep our citizens and our nation trapped in uncertainty and instability," end quote. And so it's very interesting that, of course, then all of these articles go and make these thinly veiled insinuations about the Russian influence, much like Dr. Marcus was just talking about, like Russia has just randomly swooped in there and has never had any kind of, say in that particular region. But obviously they're not questioning any of this other sketchy stuff that went on with this referendum. And again, despite all these sketchiness, the results are very, very narrow. And even, Reuters and New York Times were forced to admit how narrow this European choice was. And I mean, we saw Ursula going on her X/Twitter talking about the Moldovan European choice, but we actually know that in reality, this is really not the case. So what I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Marcus, is whether you can draw some parallels to the Ukrainian situation. You just mentioned that Ukraine will never be in NATO. You said Moldova will not be in the European Union, but whether you can talk about that weaponization of certain elements of each of these two societies and what that turned into.
America and Russia are the two superpowers in the world. Whether people like it or not, both countries must have an area which is close to their borders, which falls within their influence. So in the case of America, Canada falls within its influence. Mexico falls within its influence, and most of Latin America, with some noticeable exceptions, falls within its influence. That is the reality. That is realpolitik. Whether people like it or not, that is how it is. The same applies to Russia. Russia will not tolerate anyone attempting to gain a foothold in the former Soviet space. Now, the West achieved a foothold in the Baltic states, but that was at a time in the early 2000s when Russia was still reeling from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. If the Russia then was the Russia of today, then Moscow would have been able to prevent NATO or prevent the Baltic states from becoming members of both the European Union and NATO. But alas, that is water under the bridge. In regard to countries such as Moldova, or indeed Georgia, or indeed Ukraine, these are countries which are imperative to Russia's national security. The Americans objected profusely to when the Soviet Union deployed ICBMs in Cuba in 1962. Whatever you think of Khrushchev's motives, one of them being to counter the fact that America had nuclear warheads in Turkey, and of course Turkey shared a border with the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, the Americans strenuously objected to the presence of Soviet ICBMs in Cuba. Well, why should Russia allow America to be the dominant force in its backyard, so to speak, such as Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia? Why? Russia is a superpower. If people in America don't like that, if people in Britain don't like that, well, that's tough. That's the reality. And I personally feel that with two superpowers in the world, this actually ensures um, a great degree of stability in the world. Because look what happened after the Soviet Union was dissolved. America took advantage of the horrific situation that Russia was in the 1990s, politically, economically, and socially, to gain Western global supremacy. That was a very dangerous period. And of course, it went into the 2000s with, for example, the American illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Iraq. But Russia is again a superpower. And I think that is a good thing for the world. Yes, I'm aware that we are starting to move towards a multipolar world, but the two most powerful countries in the world will continue to be Russia and America. In regard to Ukraine, I have been saying for nearly 20 years in opinion pieces, on television, on radio, and in speeches, that the day will come when the Russian military enter Ukraine, and either all or most of Ukraine will be captured by the Russian military and will be absorbed into the Russian Federation. At the moment, Russia is not simply fighting the Ukrainian armed forces. No, Russia is fighting NATO's Ukrainian army, and by proxy, NATO itself, which means America. And I believe that at the minimum, the Russian army will advance to and capture the oblasts of Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr, which, if you are looking at a map of Ukraine, are just to the west of Kiev. From there, I often ponder, will the Russian army advance further? Because in that part of Ukraine, which is historically known as Eastern Galicia, that is where you find fierce anti-Russian sentiment. Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Volyn. Now, Transcarpathia is different. There you find a lot of pro-Russian sentiment, but nonetheless, in the westernmost part of Ukraine, it is fiercely anti-Russian. And that is because the region was for many, many years ruled, first of all, by the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Austrians, and then the Poles again. So there is a lot of Austrian blood there, a lot of Polish blood there, which is reflected by how a lot of the population are Catholic. So now that the Russian army is in Ukraine, it will not leave. When I hear people saying that the Russians will be content just to stay on the left bank of the river Dnieper, that is nonsensical, that is idiotic. Because hypothetically speaking, if the Russians were to, let's say, capture everything on the left bank of the Dnieper and to take Nikolaev and Odessa and leave it at that, well, what remains of Ukraine would still be substantial. And what remains of Ukraine would be immediately admitted as a member of NATO, meaning that the remnants of Ukraine would be bristling with NATO troops and NATO aircraft and NATO missiles. Indeed, NATO tactical aircraft based in the oblast of Kiev could reach Moscow in between 12 and 15 minutes. So the Russians will not stay on the left bank of the Dnieper. As the Soviet army did at the end of 1943, the Russian army will cross the river Dnieper. And as I said, at a bare minimum, will go to and capture Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia. And by doing that, then the Russians will look at the map and say, well, we have neutralized the threat to Russian national security. We have neutralized the threat to the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent. Could the Russian army advance further into the westernmost part of Ukraine? It's possible, but if they were to do that, then they would absorb a population into the Russian Federation, which hates everything about Russia, be it Tsarist Russia, communist Russia, modern day Russia. I suspect the Russian army won't but it is possible. So I say that about Ukraine because Moldova is also of immense importance to Russia's national security. So Russia will not allow its predominant position in Moldova to be usurped by America. And the reality is this, Nina. Despite pronouncements from the European Union about the result, the referendum result, it means nothing. They know that gone are the days when Russian influence and power in the former Soviet Union can be challenged. Russia cannot be expelled from Moldova. Azerbaijan is a country that the West in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, tried to get a foothold in at the expense of Russia. Well, that failed. And today there is a very close relationship between Baku and Moscow. Indeed, there is a close rapport between Putin and Aliyev. In Georgia, we see now a complete reversal from the days of Saakashvili, which inflicted tremendous damage on the fraternal relations between the Russian and Georgian people. Again, many Georgian people will always be grateful to Russia for having liberated Georgia from the Ottomans. Now, that's not Russian propaganda. If people think that is, I urge them to return to history class, assuming, of course, that they actually attended history class in the first place. And when it comes to Armenia, yes, there is a prime minister there who is flirting with the West, but like Sandu in Moldova, he will never be able to remove Armenia from Russia's sphere of influence. Impossible. And in Central Asia, that is well and truly within Russia's sphere of influence. And indeed, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, people across Central Asia were very angry with Russia. Why? Because they felt that they had been abandoned by Russia. Kazakhs, Turkmen, Tajiks, etc., look to Russia as an elder brother. Again, that's not Russian propaganda. I urge people to go to Central Asia and see for themselves. So yes, there is obviously a war in Ukraine. And I have no doubt that, as I said, the Russian army will capture either most or indeed possibly all of Ukraine. There is a battle emerging in Moldova. There is something happening in Georgia. But one final point, Nina. When we hear the useful idiots of the Western ruling elites, be it Western politicians or Western mainstream journalists, say that the war is coming up to being 3 years old now, and that Putin said that the Russian army will be in Kiev in 3 days. Well, that is a lie. Putin said in his announcement that it will take however long it takes, however long it requires. I will tell you who said 3 days. It was Mark Milley, the former senior US Army commander. He said that he said at the beginning of 2022, if the Russian army enters Ukraine, it will be in Kiev in 3 days. Putin never said that. No member of the Russian High Command said that. It was Milley who said that. So we see all the time opinion pieces in American newspapers or British newspapers, or the lie being told on BBC News or CNN that Putin said 3 days the Russian army will be in Kiev. No, that is not true. Again, people don't have to take my word for it. Take to the internet, put in Mark Milley, put in Kiev, 3 days, and you will see that it is he who said that and not Putin or any other Russian official.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. That's definitely an important point because it's made and then it's referring to, another article that made this point without really citing the original source. And of course, if Russia had been using American methods of carpet bombing, perhaps the timeline would have been a little bit different. We've all seen that Russia has been much more mindful of civilians to the best of its ability, and which is, one of the reasons why this war is taking a long time. But obviously, other commentators would position this as a war of attrition, where it's a deliberate tactic beyond civilian concerns. So based on your summary, I have two questions, but they're unrelated. So my initial question is, I think you're the first person on our channel that brought up the question of going beyond the left bank of Dnieper in Ukraine. And my question is leaving a smaller territory, the anti-Russian territory of Galicia, etc., is that not still leaving a problem of having this buffer state for NATO? It's going to be smaller, but it's still going to be there. My second question is unrelated, so let me know if you want me to repeat it once you answer the first one. You talked about Georgia, and usually the Moldova referendum, the way it's been covered in this media, the media sort of attaches Georgia to its coverage because of the, evil Russian influence, because Georgia is about to have parliamentary elections. And these elections in the MSM are being described as highly contested. Obviously, Georgia has been in the news this year because of this foreign agent law. It's been described as a Russian law. We talked about this topic on this channel a number of times. Obviously, we know that this law is actually based on American models more so than the Russian model. I mean, in fact, all of them go back to the initial American 1930s FARA law. But what do you think is going to happen with the Georgia elections this weekend?
So, in relation to your first question, if what I believe will happen, the Russian army crosses the river Dnieper and advances to and captures Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, if the Kremlin halts its military campaign there, then what will be left will be a relatively small area sandwiched between Poland and Hungary. Look at a map. Look at Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Volyn, and Transcarpathia. And you will see that even if it was saturated with NATO troops and NATO missiles, it is far away from the Russian heartland. Yes, it would border the new Russia, because Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia would be a part of the Russian Federation, but it wouldn't pose a military threat. The Baltic states is a very different matter, because tactical aircraft, NATO tactical aircraft operating from the Baltic states, let's say Estonia, in a hypothetical war of the Russian Federation, could reach St. Petersburg within a few minutes. So no, if the Russian army advances to and captures Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr, and the campaign is halted there permanently, then Russian national security will be preserved. In regard to Georgia, well, I wrote in Arise Rossiya back in 2020 that the day will come when a Georgian government comes to power which extends the hand of friendship to Russia, because there is no bitterness between the average Russian and the average Georgian. The reason why there was a war in 2008, in August of 2008, between Russia and Georgia, was because of that imbecile Mikhail Saakashvili, again, a trained American puppet who came to power in Georgia at the end of 2003 in what the West calls a color revolution, which in reality was a coup, no different to what happened in Serbia on the 5th of October of 2000, when Otpor overthrew President Slobodan Milosevic. From that point onwards in Georgia, from the end of 2003 onwards, Saakashvili, following the instructions of his masters in the West, militarized Georgia and was looking to provoke a conflict with Russia. And indeed, Georgian officials today have said, and this year, as it goes, that Georgia under Saakashvili instigated that war, that dreadful war in 2008. Now, I don't believe I read or saw anything from Western mainstream media covering what the Georgian authorities said this year, that that war was caused by Mikhail Saakashvili in 2008. In regard to the elections, the forthcoming elections in Georgia, undoubtedly, the hand of America, the hand of the European Union will be present, will be at play there. But Georgia suffered terribly because of the sanctions that Russia placed on it as a result of Saakashvili. And Georgians understand that Russia is not its enemy, and that the Georgian economy has been harmed tremendously. Indeed, when Russia placed a ban on the import of Georgian wine, that had a tremendous detrimental effect on the Georgian economy. So the Georgian electorate are very mindful of that. They are not naive or idiots, as Western mainstream media imply they are, as they imply everyone else in the former Soviet Union is, of course, with the exception of the Baltic states. No, the Georgian people know that they have a fraternal bond with Russia, which dates back, as I said moments ago, to when the Russian Empire liberated the Georgian people from the tyranny of the Ottomans. So, yes, there could be a clash at the forthcoming elections, depending on what the result is. But Russia is, again, the predominant outside force in Georgia. And I raised the issue of the Baltic states, and you mentioned the westernmost part of Ukraine, which is eastern Galicia. There were only two parts of the Soviet Union which never wanted to be a part of the Union, and they were the Baltic states and eastern Galicia. So when people in the West say that the Soviet Union was a prison of peoples, well, that is nonsense. That is inaccurate. And they never articulate that claim with concrete evidence. They forget about the March 1991 referendum. But it is true that the people of the Baltic states did not want to be a part of the Soviet Union. And Eastern Galicia, which today is the westernmost part of Ukraine, also did not want to be a part of the Soviet Union. But everywhere else, it did.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important to note. But also, today the Baltic states seem to have this amplified status that is incongruent with their actual economic power, their geographic size, as sort of this cannon fodder du jour, right, against Russia. And I think it's important to mention that the Baltic states were ruled by other countries, by Denmark, by Sweden, by Germany. Russia is not the only so-called colonial power in the region, yet for some reason when we get coverage about these countries, that sort of seems to slip whoever is writing, the mind of whoever is writing, because it doesn't seem to fit the narrative. I think the Georgia situation is interesting. I didn't realize that this report coming from Georgia was not in the Western media. I'm not surprised, but even immediately after that 2008 war, there was an EU report. It's been covered in places like Reuters, and it happened maybe a year later or so. It's still searchable. And they concluded the same thing, that the initial, one of my giant animals decided to visit. And the report concluded that it was Saakashvili that initiated the hostilities. Nonetheless, even though this was a report not coming from Russia, not coming from Georgia, but coming from a third party, it's barely mentioned these days. And it came pretty early after that war. So I think there's documentation coming from that as well. I'd like to jump back into... Go ahead.
Just before we move away from Georgia, there's this fresh reports that are circulating from the last 2 days that basically Georgia was offered to start war with Russia and hold out for at least 3 or 4 days. That's amazing. You know, you go to war, you stay there for 3 days, and then you move away to guerrilla warfare and hope for help from the West. So this was according to Byzantina Ivanishvili, founder of Georgian Dream Party, a high-ranking Western official, made such an offer to Irakli Garibashvili,
Who
who
is
served
the
as Georgia Prime Minister from 21 to 24. And the quote was, "There are three or 4 million of you. They won't be able to kill you all in a few days." That's basically it. You go there, some of you will die, not all because you're just too many for them to kill you in 3 or 4 days. Well, I don't know, but and go to war, die. That's a good idea for your country. That's perfect for you.
No, I think it's not actually that new. The leaders of the Georgian Dream Party have been mentioning this at least for a year, saying that they were basically tasked with opening a second front against Russia to drain its manpower and its supplies, and they decided that they would prefer not to be fully destroyed in this conflict because they're obviously much smaller and capable than the NATO-trained Ukrainian army. But yes, it's very interesting to me how open these politicians have been in the media, and that information is accessible. Sometimes it gets translated into English, not always. And I think that does show you that change in direction from the Saakashvili, first decade of the 21st century, of being as problematic for Russia as possible, doing his master's bidding. And of course, we know that Saakashvili has been in prison for a while. So that also tells you a little bit about the change of attitude toward his leadership in Georgia. And I would say that you would still see some anti-Russian sentiment coming from Georgians on the internet. We don't know if they're real people, of course, or bots, but I would say it's very typical of the loudest minority, perhaps, not representing the views of people who want not necessarily more Russian influence in the region, but just having normalized relations. Because again, it's a small country. Its industries are tourism, wine export, fruit, etc., etc. And Russia was one of the major markets that would import these things. As a part Georgian, I have to endorse Georgian wine as one of the best in the world, probably the best in the world. I know you live in Italy, Marcelo. You'll probably disagree with me, but I stand by my point. It's not very easy to get in North America in larger cities. So definitely, I think there's been a little bit of a realization. And I think that also speaks to Russian foreign policy of letting things play out instead of just reacting immediately. And, if you think about how long it took Russia to respond to NATO, it took 30 years or so. So I think in the case of Georgia, it's a similar trajectory of letting things be until there is a realization that whether or not you like it, you are a neighbor and you're going to have some kind of a relationship. And obviously it's mutually beneficial to have a relationship that's more amicable than not. So I would like to go back to Moldova. And again, if we're reading Western, I'm always interested in what the Western media is saying, because it sort of presents things that are partly truthful and then leaves out information. And that's basically, a lot of times it's propaganda by omission rather than necessarily, not necessarily going and making claims that are completely false. But anyway, the two regions that they talk about are the ones that Dr. Marcus mentioned. One is Gagauzia, which is how we say it in Russian. I don't know if in English we're supposed to say Gagauzia because it has that AU. And that's the Turkic people that are Orthodox, and Western media describes them as pro-Russian, whatever that means. And then, of course, Transnistria, which is a, breakaway republic that's not really internationally recognized yet. But I was curious what your opinion about that is, whether those two regions are the most important in this brewing conflict, or whether it's the entire country. And specifically, whether Transnistria's importance is amplified, is it because of its proximity to Ukraine?
Well, going back to 1992, when Moldova emerged as an independent country, the Moldovan government offered autonomy to the Gagauz people, and they accepted that. The people on the left bank of the Dniester Russians, Ukrainians, and some ethnic Moldovans were also offered autonomy. But Tiraspol, the capital of became Transnistria, left bank of the river Dniester, rejected autonomy. That resulted in the war after Transnistria was formed, and then in the summer of 1992, the Russian army arrived and brought the war to an end. But the Russian government hasn't recognized Transnistria as independent, and there is a reason for that. In the 1990s, there was, politically speaking, a strong pro-Western movement and a pro-Romanian movement in Moldova. And Russia was weakened. Its presence in Moldova was seriously weakened. That is why the Kremlin never recognized Transnistria, because if the Kremlin in the 1990s or in the early 2000s recognized Transnistria as independent, then Moldova, the Moldovan government of the time, would have redrawn its borders, would have excluded Transnistria, and then it would have joined the European Union and NATO, or maybe NATO first and then the European Union, and then Russia would have been in trouble. But by Transnistria remaining officially part of Moldova, with a very substantial Russian military presence in Transnistria, this enables, it enabled especially in the 1990s, but it still enables today, Russia to block any attempt by any Moldovan government to bring Moldova into the West's sphere of influence. And also, the Russian presence in Transnistria following the coup in Ukraine in February of 2014 increased. Why? Because the Kremlin attempted to put pressure on the Ukrainian government to give them the feeling that they are encircled by Russia from the east and by the Russian military presence in Transnistria from the west. So people have often asked, myself for example, why didn't Russia recognize Transnistria as independent? Because it is because by Transnistria being officially part of Moldova, as it still is, that is a thorn in the side of any Moldovan politician who tries to bring Moldova into the West's sphere of influence. That is a major factor as to why Sandu has failed ever since 2020. But it is not the only reason. As I said, you have the cultural attachments between Moldovans, including ethnic Moldovans, and Russia. Russia is the principal energy supplier. Russia is the principal investor, and it still is, even after 4 years of Sandu as president. Russia still is the principal investor. This is 2024. Russia cannot be threatened as it was in the 1990s and for most of the 2000s. Russia has resurrected its Soviet era influence and power. Russia is once again a superpower, and that is why we see this hysterical attempts by Western mainstream media to say that Eastern Europe, Central Europe, indeed the whole of Europe is threatened by Russia, because they know that their dream of encircling Russia on its western borders with NATO member states from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea has failed, because Ukraine will never become a member of NATO, or Ukraine as we know it today will never become a member of NATO. As I said, now that the Russian army is in Ukraine, nothing can expel it and nothing can resist its advances. NATO has saturated Ukraine with NATO weaponry. That is why, or that is the cardinal factor as to why the Russian advance is occurring at a slow rate, because it's saturated with NATO weaponry. But also, the Russian High Command is employing a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts to the Ukrainian armed forces, meaning the Russian High Command is bleeding to death the Ukrainian military. Yes, that is brutal, but war is brutal. I wish to God there had never been a war in Ukraine. This was a war that could have been avoided if the Western ruling elites had recognized that Ukraine does fall within Russia's traditional sphere of influence, like Latin America does. Let us not forget about the Monroe Doctrine, which the Americans still adhere to today, whereby the Americans will not tolerate any other foreign power in Latin America other than itself. So if America can have a sphere of influence, then Russia can have a sphere of influence.
Well, I think you can also go even farther or further with the question of the Russian sphere of influence, because America did not have control of Latin America by integrating those people and having, historic populations of Americans living there. Whereas in the Russian case, whether through the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, there are much, much, much deeper roots. And obviously in some cases, like Ukraine, which we've, discussed so often on this channel, the connections go back centuries. Families in Russia have families across the border in Ukraine even today. So it's a more, if a claim can be made about a sphere of influence, I would say in the Russian case, it goes beyond security interests and it involves these deep cultural, historic connections. So I would like to jump into the question of NATO. On this channel, we've had very different perceptions of this organization. Some people think that NATO, they would qualify it as a paper tiger, despite the apparent successes of unifying NATO first in the 90s, and now with Finland and Sweden being brought in as a result of the Ukrainian situation, or perhaps this was pre-planned. People still think that these are sort of lagging indicators and NATO is past its expiration dates. Others think we had a few people recently who think that it's actually a formidable alliance. It's going to stay the strongest military alliance in the world, and it's in the foreseeable future. It's something that Russia just has to accept. What is your perception of NATO?
History teaches us that all is impermanent, meaning nothing lasts forever. Who thought the Habsburg Empire would come to an end? Who thought the Ottoman Empire would come to an end? Who thought the Romanov Empire would come to an end? The day will come when NATO ceases to exist. I should first of all say that during the Cold War, which began officially in 1947 and ended in 1989 when Bush Sr. and the idiotic Gorbachev announced in 1989 that the Cold War was over. In that period, it is reasonable to argue that NATO was a defensive military bloc. I do not believe that there was concrete evidence to support the argument that the Soviet Union wished to conquer Western Europe, including Britain. No. Stalin in 1945 achieved something that his predecessors, going back to Tsarist times, had never had in Eastern Europe: a first line of defense. How many times had Russia been invaded through Eastern Europe? So that's what Eastern Europe was essentially for. It was a first line of defense. So if Russia, or Soviet Union as it was then, was to be attacked, whichever army attacking it would have to come through the Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe. I should also say that Stalin was not a revolutionary. He did not have to withdraw the Red Army from Vienna. The Red Army captured Vienna. He didn't have to withdraw it, but he did, because he wanted the Grand Alliance to continue. Stalin did not have to allow the British and the Americans and the French to come to Berlin. After all, the Red Army captured Berlin. The campaign to capture Berlin incurred 300,000 Soviet casualties, of which 100,000 were fatalities. But he did allow them, the Western powers, to come to Berlin. Why? Because he wanted the Grand Alliance to continue. Stalin was not a revolutionary. But I digress. I do think it's a reasonable argument that during the Cold War, yes, NATO was a defensive military bloc. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, NATO took on a very different appearance. In practice, NATO became a weapon for ensuring American dominance of the new Europe, for example, with the Western Balkans, the former Yugoslavia. In 1999, NATO bombed criminally, illegally, murderously, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which comprised Serbia and Montenegro. Now, any enlightened, level-headed human being knows that NATO's unprovoked war of aggression against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia violated international law and the United Nations Charter. That is irrefutable. But how many people, Nina, know that by attacking the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, NATO violated its own founding treaty? Specifically, Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty stipulates that NATO will never use force to resolve a dispute. And yet, in 1999, that is exactly what NATO did. So from 1999 onwards, NATO became an expansionist, aggressive, and a criminal military bloc. Again, I say to your viewers, you don't have to take my word for it. Just have a look at NATO's North Atlantic Treaty, specifically Article 1. Now, you asked me about the strength of NATO. America is NATO. NATO is America. No America, no NATO. Yes, there are some other powerful militaries in NATO, such as the French military, to a lesser extent the British military, but still Britain has a strategic nuclear deterrent, which of course cannot be sidelined. Poland has a strong military. Greece has a strong military. Turkey has a strong military. But that's about it. Montenegro? That's laughable. The Baltic states, that's laughable. Other countries, Belgium, that is laughable. Some of these countries may have a defense industry, but that's it. It is NATO is America. So if we are talking about NATO as a whole, then I would not subscribe to the argument that NATO is a powerful military bloc. But if we are talking about NATO being America, then yes, it is a powerful military bloc. When people say, whoever they are, that there could be a war between NATO and Russia, which will never happen, by the way, there will not be a World War III. That's just hysterical garbage, because there is what I call the elite of the elite in America and in Russia. People whom you will never see on television, people whose names you will never know. They have been tasked ever since the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis with preserving peace between America and Russia. They talk to each other every single day of the year. They are from the political elite, the military elite, and the intelligence elite. I'm not talking about politicians, and I'm not talking about generals in Russia or in America who you see on television. No, these people are anonymous. So there will not be a war. But when people say there could be a war between NATO and Russia, What that means in reality is a war between America and Russia. How many countries in NATO would really go to war with Russia? Would Greece go to war with Russia? The Greek government is compliant to the West, but much of the Greek population has an affinity with Russia because, of course, of a shared Orthodox identity. There are other countries which would not go to war with Russia. So I believe that following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, starting from the early 2000s onwards, NATO overstretched itself when it extended into the former Eastern Bloc. For example, Bulgaria. Outside of the former Soviet Union, who are Russians closest to in cultural terms? Well, it's not Serbs. They're very, very close, but it's not Serbs. It's Bulgarians. Bulgarians and Russians are practically the same people. Look at their culture, look at their language. Again, the Bulgarians will always remember how the Russian Empire liberated Bulgaria from Ottoman rule. So a Bulgarian government might say, we will go to war with Russia if the day comes. But would the Bulgarian people go to war with Russia? I think not. So NATO is America. America is NATO. America is a military superpower. It is a nuclear superpower. Yes, I believe there are serious problems within the American military. For example, the cancerous effects of woke within the ranks of the American military. But let us not exaggerate that. The American military is still an almighty military force. So is the Russian military. So again, I can only reiterate what I said. Certain members of NATO are very powerful, principally America, but the rest of them, their militaries are at best satisfactory, and many of them are pitiful.
Thank you for clarifying that. Go ahead.
One point that's quite important is that I don't see NATO neither a defensive alliance nor just a offensive alliance. It's just an alliance to protect the United States. That's it. So if war has to come against NATO, you Baltic go first, and then we can send French and whatever in the middle, but just don't let them come to the United States.
Well, let me add this. What did Lord Ismay say of NATO when it was formed in 1949? Lord Ismay.
To keep Germany down and to keep Russians out. Absolutely. That was one of the famous statements.
Absolutely. That says it all. He said it very clearly, though when he said to keep Russia out of Europe, well, that was illogical because, of course, geographically speaking, Europe ends at the Ural Mountains. But anyway, that is what Ismay said. Again, NATO is America. America is NATO.
To quickly comment on your discussion about Stalin in 1945, I think that was really important to mention, and perhaps our viewers may not know, but if you go back and read his translated quotes, his quotes translated to English, he very much wanted to preserve the status quo of the big three, right, of the Grand Alliance, and he made very reasonable statements. He would tell the Anglo-Americans that he kind of felt were teaming up against him, even though he had a better relationship with Roosevelt, and then he died. He would say things like, I'm not questioning your control over Belgium. Why are you questioning my ability to go into Poland, which the Red Army liberated? So he was trying to think of it very logically, dividing the world into the spheres of influence, partly based on what each of the armies conquered. But of course, the Red Army gave up huge chunks of what it conquered. You mentioned Vienna, you mentioned Berlin, a huge loss of life of, the Red Army soldiers. So I think that's really important to note, because Stalin was he was a very brutal ruler, but he was very shrewd and very intelligent and very reasonable when it came to dealing internationally in terms of foreign policy. And my question to you is then, is there any future with this NATO quasi-expansion into East Asia, with the rise of China, with obviously NATO is called the North Atlantic Treaty, but of course Greece and Turkey are not exactly in the North Atlantic. And recently we've seen all these headlines over the past 2 years of containing China, therefore NATO has to make friends in East Asia to be friends against China. Do you see any future in that, or is this just posturing, political posturing?
Ideally, I believe that the Western ruling elites who rule, not govern, rule the Western world would like to expand NATO to the other side of the world to, as they say, contain the threat from China. But in reality, that will not happen. America will remain a superpower unless, of course, it collapses. But other than that, it will remain a superpower. It will remain a formidable political, economic, and military force. I think a lot of people get quite excited when they say that Pax Americana is about to collapse. No, that is not going to happen. I think also we should be mindful of this. In regard to the BRICS, yes, it has expanded. Yes, it is playing a cardinal role in ushering in a multipolar world, though America and Russia will always be the two most powerful countries in the world. But let us not exaggerate the importance of the BRICS. And let me explain why. All of those countries, such as China, India, and Saudi Arabia, have very, very close economic relationships with America. When people say that China and America are foes, they are gravely mistaken. Yes, there is political tension between the two, but the American and Chinese economies are entwined. If there was to be a rupture in that relationship, then the American economy would suffer enormously, and the Chinese economy would suffer enormously and probably suffer more. The Chinese economic miracle, and I am not, Nina, belittling the Chinese, but the Chinese economic miracle is largely based on its trade and investment relationship with America. Then you have Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is an ardent friend and ally to America. Yes, Saudi Arabia is pursuing a relationship with Russia, but not at the expense of its relationship with America. Let's not forget, Saudi Arabia and Israel are the two main conduits for Western influence and power in West Asia, in the Middle East. Israel and Saudi Arabia enjoy an unofficial strategic partnership with each other. And then you have India and Brazil. Again, they have very close economic relationships with America and other Western countries, such as Britain, especially when it comes to India and Britain. So I don't believe, for a number of reasons, that NATO will be expanded to Southeast Asia, to the Far East. And as I said, there are a number of reasons for that. But again, I repeat, people must not exaggerate the importance of the BRICS. China is not breaking away from America, nor is Brazil, nor is South Africa, nor is Saudi Arabia, nor is India, and so on and so on.
Well, I think it's important to mention that it's not about friendship, it's about mutual benefit. And at some point, that mutual benefit of working with the United States to the extent that these countries have been may be reduced. And at that point, the importance of BRICS may or may not be amplified because obviously we live in a very dynamic world. And my last question to you, Dr. Marcus, would be about how these divided countries, these post-Soviet countries, may be used in the future. We've all seen the RAND report, I can't remember if it's 2018 or 2019, that described all these countries in the post-Soviet sphere and the ways they can be weaponized against Russia to create all these numerous flashpoints along its borders. Some of them are playing out right now, some of them have failed. I know it's very difficult to make a forecast, but what is your hunch about the usage of these internal divisions in these post-Soviet states and how successful they can be to target Russia?
On the contrary, Nina, it's not difficult for me to make a forecast. Excluding Ukraine, where there is an ongoing war, this is 2024. This is not the 1990s. This is not the 2000s. Russia is dominant throughout the former Soviet space, of course, with the exception of the Baltic states. Russia is dominant in Moldova. There might be a challenge, but Russia will not be expelled from there. Russia will not be expelled from the South Caucasus. The West tried, for example, in Azerbaijan, but for a number of reasons, they failed. One of them is that Aliyev Sr. understood the mistake that Saakashvili's Georgia made. Do not antagonize, in simple English, Big Brother. And also because of the allegations of human rights abuses made by various Western NGOs against the Azerbaijani government in recent years, this has increased the closeness between Baku and Moscow. In Central Asia, Russia is overwhelmingly the dominant force. I'll tell you, Nina, if there's any country in the world that could challenge Russia in Central Asia, it's not America, it's China. Yes, there is a strategic partnership now between Russia and China. Yes, bilateral relations are magnificent, economic relations magnificent. But in my book, Arise Russia, I describe it as a relationship of necessity. There is still suspicion in Moscow and Beijing towards each other. And there's not enough time for me to elaborate, but it is a relationship of necessity. The Russians are acutely aware that China's Silk Route, or the Chinese want it to go through Central Asia, that is a threat to Russia's Eurasian Union. So the Americans, the West, the Americans cannot challenge the Russians, successfully challenge them anywhere in the former Soviet space, apart from in Ukraine. But there's a war there, and as I said, the Russian army will emerge victorious. But again, if there's any country that would have the capability to rival Russia in Central Asia, it would be China.
Perhaps we can have you back at some point to discuss the way China has been making inroads in Central Asia. I mean, it's been improving its relationship with Belarus. That economic expansion is happening there as well. I haven't really seen Russia challenging it or having a problem with it yet, but it's definitely something to watch out for. Marcelo, do you have any questions for Dr. Marcus, or is there anything in the chat that I haven't been looking at that is noteworthy and that we can ask him?
Most of the chat is mostly commentaries, comments. So no big questions here. No, I think I asked mostly everything I had in mind. I'm still checking the chat. If you have any last question, you can go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't have any last questions, but I would like Dr. Marcus to tell us what he's working on right now, perhaps something that hasn't been released. The best places to follow his work, I've linked some of them in the description to the YouTube live, but he can maybe tell us a little bit more about what he's doing right now.
Indeed. At the moment, I'm carrying out archival research at the National Archives in Kew, London. Specifically, I'm looking at how what the British assessments were of the Soviet army in East Germany in the 50s and the 60s. Eventually, I would like to go into the 1970s and the 1980s, but for the time being, I'm looking at how they rated the Soviet army based in East Germany in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And I'm very much hoping that that will result in me writing a book in the foreseeable future. Also, I'm tentatively researching a battle which occurred in early 1944 on the Eastern Front at a place called Korsun, which today is in Ukraine. It was a very brutal battle between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. There is no account of this battle in the English-speaking language, in the English-speaking world. So I am hoping to rectify that. It will take time, but what Korsun demonstrated was the coming together of Soviet military strategy, the coming together of coordinating actions between the Soviet army and the Air Force. As I said, it was a brutal battle, a very intriguing battle. And it took the interest of the British military mission based in Moscow at that time. And also it took the interest of the Canadian military mission and the American military mission in Moscow. So those are the two areas I'm currently carrying out archival research into.
Okay, and what is the best place to follow you? Is it your X/Twitter? Is it your YouTube? Where can people read your sort of more, bite-sized pieces of analysis?
I am on YouTube. I am on X. I am on Facebook. I am on Rumble. I am on Getter. I am on Gab, and I'm also on Odyssey. Both of my books are for sale on Amazon. Yes, I do not like Amazon one bit whatsoever, but one needs an outlet to sell one's books from. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but without that, I would be near enough on my own trying to sell books from, for example, my Facebook page or my X page. So that is where people can find me and engage with me. And I will say this, I am open-minded to any argument whatsoever, providing it is corroborated with primary source evidence and is presented in a professional, intelligent, and respectful manner. Again, I reiterate, I am open-minded to any argument about any period of history, providing it is supported with primary source evidence, be it government files, diaries, personal papers, not secondary source material, primary source material. I want to see documents from the time, official documents, and therein lies something that Western mainstream media never presents to support its claims, if you can even call it a claim, because a claim, by its very definition, means it has supporting evidence, concrete evidence. Western mainstream media never uses primary source evidence to support its claims. So that is why we should be different to Western mainstream media. Always insist on seeing documents from the time.
Yes, this is the historian in you speaking, and I think it highlights a really important point that despite all the problems in the Western academia, specifically in North America, which is where I can draw my experience from, historians are generally more reasonable because they have a higher burden of proof, like going to the archives, than journalists or people that are only using secondary sources. So there's a really big disconnect between people that would write, let's say, the history of the Soviet Union, even from a politically charged perspective in the West versus journalists that would be covering the same topics with very little primary source information. So that's a really important point to make. Well, thank you, Dr. Marcus. We would love to have you back. This was very elucidating. You made a lot of really cogent points, very specific points. Again, I know this is the historian in you speaking. Marcelo, any parting words?
Thank you very much, Mr. Dr. Papadopoulos. And remember that we're going to release all the links on the description. If you like, remember to like. If you don't like, well, don't like. And see you guys next time.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back. Thank you, Dr. Marcus. And thank you, everyone else, for watching. See you in the next episode.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.